In the autumn of 1847, deep in the Alabama cane brakes where the mist clung to rotting magnolia blossoms and the air hung thick with secrets, a question emerged that would haunt Blackgum County for generations. What if the ultimate taboo was not just broken, but systematized? What if a mother's desperate remedy for a fading bloodline became something far more monstrous than the sickness it claimed to cure? The records contradict themselves, as they always do when truth becomes too terrible for official memory, but the whispers persisted in parlors and slave quarters alike, speaking of widow Cora Halcyon and her isolated plantation where the nursery held no living children, where ledger books recorded births and deaths in the same cold script reserved for livestock, and where two grown sons were made instruments of their mother's consuming obsession. They say she bred her own blood with enslaved women, that the resulting infants vanished into her private chambers, that her mysterious revitalization came at a price written in the ledger as spoiled goods. The only witness brave enough to speak was sold down the river before her testimony could take root, leaving behind nothing but a scrap of sackcloth and words that refused to die. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. This was not just crime. This was an operation that fed on human lives for decades. And to understand the horror that grew in those swampy bottomlands, one must first understand the place where such darkness could take root and flourish. Blackgum County, Alabama, in 1847, was a landscape designed by nature to keep secrets. The county stretched across river bottomlands where Spanish moss draped like funeral shrouds from ancient cypress trees, where cane brakes grew so thick that a man could disappear 10 feet from a cleared path and never be found. It was here, in a basin surrounded by impassable bog and swampland, that Cornelius Halcyon had carved out his kingdom decades before his death. Halcyon Grove sat like an island of supposed civilization in an ocean of wilderness, accessible only by a single rutted road that wound through miles of fetid marsh. The plantation house itself told the story of a family's declining fortunes, its Greek revival columns now stained with mildew, its once white paint peeling away in long, leprous strips. The broad veranda sagged under the weight of neglect, its floorboards soft with rot that creaked ominously under even the lightest footstep. Behind the main house, the slave quarters formed a neat row of cabins, their windows like hollow eyes staring across the cotton fields toward the dark wall of cane. The air hung heavy with the sweet stench of decay, where fallen magnolia blossoms rotted in stagnant pools, and the constant drone of mosquitoes provided the only soundtrack to the oppressive silence. But it was the smaller building that drew the most whispered attention, a structure downwind from both house and quarters that the family called the infirmary. Its windows were always shuttered, its single door always locked, and the path leading to it was worn smooth by feet that came and went in darkness. Even the boldest field hands gave it wide berth, crossing themselves when they passed and muttering prayers their grandmothers had taught them. The isolation was complete, deliberate, and absolute. No neighboring plantation lay within 20 miles. No road offered easy escape, and the swamp that surrounded Halcyon Grove was known to swallow horses and riders whole during the flood seasons. What happened here happened in a kingdom unto itself, where the only law was the will of whoever commanded the main house, and the only witnesses were those who could never speak freely. This was not a home. It was a secluded kingdom, and every kingdom has its rulers. The rulers of this decaying realm were themselves a study in deterioration, a family whose blood had grown as thin as their fortunes. When Cornelius Halcyon died in 1839, he left behind more than debts and a crumbling plantation. His final testament contained a clause that would haunt his survivors, stipulating that the estate's value was inextricably tied to its living chattel. The plantation could only be sold or mortgaged based on the number of enslaved souls it contained, creating a grotesque mathematics where human lives became literal currency. His widow, Cora Halcyon, had been considered a beauty in her youth, but 8 years of widowhood had transformed her into something altogether different. Neighbors who still dared to visit spoke in hushed tones of her unnatural pallor, her sunken eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fever, and her obsession with what she called the purity of bloodlines. She spent hours in her darkened chambers, surrounded by vials of murky tonics and strange remedies, convinced that some hereditary weakness was consuming her family from within. Dr. Alistair Finch, the county physician, had filled pages of his private medical folio with observations about the Halcyon family's peculiar constitution. He noted their shared lethargy, their tendency toward what he diplomatically termed nervous exhaustion, and most disturbing of all, their increasing isolation from the outside world. The family rarely left the plantation, rarely entertained guests, and seemed to exist in a bubble of their own making, where normal social conventions held no sway. Cora's eldest son, Silas, carried himself with the bearing of a man prematurely aged by responsibility he never wanted. At 32, he walked with a pronounced limp that required the aid of a silver-tipped cane, a reminder of a childhood accident that had left him forever dependent on his mother's care. His younger brother Abner presented an even more tragic figure. Simple-minded and easily led, he spent his days whittling small, malformed wooden animals and following his mother's instructions with the unquestioning obedience of a trained hound. The household staff, both enslaved and free, spoke of strange sounds emanating from the main house at all hours, of Cora's midnight wanderings through the quarters, of conversations held in whispers behind locked doors. Miss Lila, Cora's personal maid, had developed a permanent expression of barely contained terror, her hands trembling as she served meals and her eyes darting constantly towards the exits, as if planning an escape she would never dare attempt. But the most chilling aspect of the Halcyon family was not their obvious decline, but their growing conviction that their bloodline required strengthening through methods that decent society would never countenance. Cora had begun to speak openly, at least within the confines of her own home, about the necessity of introducing new vitality into old stock, about experiments that might restore what time and inbreeding had weakened. The family's internal sickness was about to become an external terror, and the first signs of what was to come had already begun to manifest in ways that would make even hardened observers question everything they thought they knew about the depths of human depravity. The autumn of 1846 brought with it the first event that should have served as a warning, though at the time it passed with little more than whispered speculation among the enslaved community. A young woman named Grace, barely 20 years old and heavy with child, had been moved from the main quarters to the isolated infirmary building as her time approached. The move itself was not unusual. Cora Halcyon had always insisted on maintaining strict control over births on the plantation, claiming it was necessary for proper record-keeping and medical care. What troubled those who noticed was the selection process itself. Grace had not been chosen for isolation because she was sickly or because her pregnancy showed signs of complications. Indeed, she was one of the healthiest young women on the plantation, strong and capable, with the kind of vitality that should have promised an easy delivery and a robust child. More disturbing still was the identity of the father, whispered about in the quarters but never spoken aloud, where it might be overheard by the wrong ears. When Grace's labor began on a rain-soaked October night, only Cora and Miss Lila were permitted in the infirmary. The screams that echoed across the plantation grounds were not unusual for childbirth, but they seemed to last far longer than they should have. stretching through the night and into the gray dawn until they suddenly, abruptly stopped. By the time Dr. Finch arrived the following morning, summoned by a message that spoke only of a stillbirth, the infant was already prepared for burial. Finch's examination was brief and perfunctory, conducted under Cora's watchful eye in a room that reeked of medicinal spirits and something else he could not quite identify. The child, he noted in his private medical folio, was unusually pale even for a stillborn infant, with an almost translucent quality to the skin that spoke of profound anemia or blood loss. When he inquired about the circumstances of the death, Cora insisted it had been born lifeless, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence that required no further investigation. But it was the burial that planted the first seeds of genuine unease among those who witnessed it. Rather than being interred in the designated burial ground used for all plantation deaths, the tiny corpse was taken deep into the swamp under cover of darkness and buried in an unmarked grave that would disappear beneath the next flood. Grace herself was moved back to the quarters in a state of such profound grief and shock that she seemed barely capable of coherent speech, speaking only of dreams filled with hungry darkness and the sound of something feeding in the night. The plantation ledger recorded the event with characteristic coldness, a single-line entry that read simply, "Grace stillborn, asset depreciated." But those who knew how to read between the lines noticed something else, a small notation in the margin that would later prove significant. Yield nil, spoilage noted. This was not seen as a tragedy, but as the first failure of a new process, and failures, as any plantation owner knew, were simply problems to be solved through better methods and stricter controls. By the autumn of 1847, the weight of Cornelius Halcyon's final testament had begun to crush his widow's remaining options, like a vice slowly tightening around her throat. The estate's mounting debts required either an immediate sale or a comprehensive mortgage, but both demanded an accurate assessment of the plantation's true value. Since that value was legally bound to the number of enslaved souls in residence, Cora found herself facing an inventory that would expose every aspect of her domain to outside scrutiny. The man she chose for this delicate task was Elias Thorne, a traveling bookkeeper and land assessor from Mobile, whose reputation for discretion was matched only by his desperate need for steady employment. Thorne carried his own burden of secrets, chief among them a forged document that had saved his previous position but left him vulnerable to blackmail. When Cora's letter arrived offering generous compensation for what appeared to be routine plantation accounting, he saw it as salvation from his mounting financial troubles. Thorne arrived at Halcyon Grove on a gray October morning when the mist hung so thick over the swampland that the plantation house seemed to emerge from the fog like a ship materializing from a dream. His first impression was of genteel decay, the kind of gradual decline that spoke of old money slowly bleeding away. But there was something else in the atmosphere, a tension that made the hair on his arms stand on end and set his nerves perpetually on edge. Cora received him in the main parlor with all the formality of a woman determined to maintain appearances, despite the obvious signs of her family's deterioration. She was gracious but distant, her pale hands never quite still as she explained the scope of his work. He would need to conduct a complete inventory of all assets, living and otherwise cross-reference the plantation ledgers with the actual population, and provide a comprehensive valuation suitable for presentation to potential creditors. What struck Thorne immediately was the strange segregation he observed during his first tour of the quarters. Pregnant women were housed separately from the general population, kept in conditions that seemed almost luxurious by plantation standards, but isolated in a way that served no obvious practical purpose. When he inquired about this arrangement, Cora explained it as a medical precaution, a way to ensure the health of both mothers and infants during the critical birthing period. But it was the household staff's behavior that truly unsettled him. The enslaved men and women who served in the main house moved with the careful, measured steps of people walking through a minefield. Their eyes never met his directly. Their responses to questions were brief and carefully neutral, and there was an undercurrent of barely controlled fear that seemed to permeate every interaction. Silas Halcyon, when Thorne finally met him, proved to be a man consumed by nervous energy despite his physical limitations. He tapped his silver-tipped cane incessantly against the floor, spoke in clipped, anxious sentences, and seemed perpetually on the verge of saying something important before thinking better of it. His brother Abner was even more disturbing, a grown man with the mind of a child who spent their conversations whittling increasingly grotesque wooden figures while humming tunelessly to himself. As Thorne settled into his temporary quarters and began his work, he could not shake the feeling that he had stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple financial assessment. The numbers in the ledgers told one story, but the atmosphere of the plantation whispered of secrets that went far deeper than mere bookkeeping irregularities. A man who understood numbers was about to find a column that didn't add up, and the discovery would force him to confront horrors that no amount of mathematical precision could fully quantify or explain. The truth of what transpired at Halcyon Grove would eventually emerge from the testimony of a single witness, a woman whose courage in the face of unimaginable consequences would provide the only first-hand account of a system so methodical in its depravity that it operated with the efficiency of any other plantation enterprise. Hester, the enslaved midwife who had attended births on the plantation for nearly 2 decades, would later describe a process that transformed the most fundamental human experience into something cold, calculated, and utterly devoid of humanity. The selection process began with Cora's careful observation of the enslaved women during their monthly cycles, noting which were of prime childbearing age and possessed what she termed the proper physical characteristics. Youth was essential, as was good health, but there was another quality she sought that was harder to define, something she called vitality that seemed to manifest in the brightness of the eyes and the strength of the voice. Once identified, these women would find themselves subjected to subtle changes in their living conditions, moved to better quarters, given improved food rations, and most disturbingly, assigned to work details that brought them into regular contact with either Silas or Abner. The assignations themselves were never spoken of directly, conducted under the cover of fabricated work assignments or medical examinations that required privacy. Cora would summon one of her sons to her chambers for what she called their filial duties, explaining in terms that brooked no argument that the family's survival depended on their compliance. Silas, burdened by his physical limitations and financial dependence, submitted to these demands with barely concealed revulsion. Abner, whose simple mind could not fully grasp the implications of what was being asked, obeyed with the same unquestioning loyalty he showed in all matters concerning his mother. The women who found themselves selected for this program were promised privileges for their cooperation, better treatment for any existing children, and the possibility of eventual freedom. Those who resisted faced threats not just to themselves, but to their families, punishments that ranged from sale to distant plantations to more immediate and violent consequences. The choice, such as it was, became no choice at all. Once pregnancy was confirmed, the selected women were moved to the infirmary building under the pretense of receiving specialized medical care. Here they remained isolated from the general population, attended only by Hester and Miss Lila, fed a diet rich in iron and strange herbal supplements that Cora claimed would ensure the health of both mother and child. The isolation served multiple purposes, preventing the pregnant women from sharing their experiences with others and creating an environment where Cora could monitor every aspect of their condition. But it was what happened after delivery that revealed the true horror of the system. The infants, invariably pale and often sickly, were removed from their mothers immediately upon birth and taken directly to the main house. The mothers were told their children had died in delivery, a tragedy but not uncommon given the primitive medical conditions of the era. Their grief was acknowledged but not dwelt upon, and within days they were returned to their regular duties as if nothing had happened. Yet witnesses in the main house reported seeing Cora emerge from her chambers in the days following each birth with a renewed vitality that seemed to defy her apparent illness. Her pallor would improve, her energy would return, and for weeks she would move about the plantation with an almost manic enthusiasm. She would speak cryptically of the necessity of renewal, of old blood requiring new strength, and of remedies that civilized society could never understand or condone. If you've been following this investigation so far, hit that subscribe button, because the deeper we dig into this story, the more disturbing the truth becomes. The machine was efficient, methodical, and utterly without conscience, but it relied on one thing it could not fully control: the presence of a witness whose moral compass would eventually compel her to break the silence that made such horrors possible. Hester had delivered more than 100 children during her years at Halcyon Grove, but by the autumn of 1847 she could no longer pretend that what was happening in the infirmary was anything approaching normal medical practice. A woman of quiet intelligence who had learned to read, despite the plantation's prohibitions against slave literacy, she had begun keeping her own careful records of the births she attended, scratching marks into a piece of bark hidden beneath her cabin's floorboards. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable and horrifying. Every infant born of the selection program displayed the same troubling characteristics: an unnatural pallor that spoke of profound anemia, a weakness that made their cries sound more like whispers, and most disturbing of all, a rapid deterioration that seemed to accelerate after their removal from the infirmary. When she dared to ask Cora about these observations, she was told that such weakness was to be expected from impure bloodlines, and that the infants were being given special care in the main house to address their constitutional deficiencies. But Hester knew the sounds of the plantation better than anyone, and the sounds that emerged from the main house in the days following each birth were not the sounds of infant care. Instead, she heard something that made her blood run cold: the quiet, methodical sounds of preparation, followed by periods of absolute silence, and then the soft, satisfied sighs of someone whose hunger had been thoroughly sated. The breaking point came with the birth of a child she would later describe in her testimony as the most perfect infant she had ever delivered. Born to a young woman named Sarah, the child was strong, alert, and possessed of a healthy pink complexion that should have promised a long and vigorous life. Yet within hours of the birth, Hester watched as the infant's vitality seemed to drain away, its skin growing pale and translucent, its breathing becoming shallow and labored. When Cora arrived to collect the child, Hester made a decision that would change everything. Instead of handing over the infant directly, she wrapped it carefully in a clean cloth and insisted on accompanying Cora to the main house to ensure its safe delivery. What she witnessed in Cora's private chambers would haunt her for the rest of her life and provide the testimony that would eventually expose the full extent of the horrors at Halcyon Grove. Cora's chamber was arranged like a macabre nursery, with an ornate cradle that had never held a living child, and shelves lined with small porcelain bowls that gleamed white in the candlelight. The infant was placed in the cradle, but not for comfort or care. Instead, Hester watched in horror as Cora produced a small silver blade and began what she called the preparation, speaking in soothing tones about the necessity of renewal and the ancient remedies that modern medicine had forgotten. The witness could stomach no more. In a moment of desperate courage, Hester snatched the infant from the cradle and fled the chamber, racing through the main house and into the swamp before anyone could stop her. She carried the child deep into the canebrakes, hoping against hope that she could somehow nurse it back to health. But the damage had already been done. The infant died in her arms as the sun rose, its last breath a whisper that seemed to carry the weight of all the others who had perished before it. It was then that Hester made the most dangerous decision of her life. She would find a way to tell someone outside the plantation what was happening, someone who might have the power to stop the horror before it claimed more victims. The opportunity came when she learned of Elias Thorne's presence at Halcyon Grove, a man from the outside world who might be willing to listen if she could find the courage to approach him. The testimony she prepared was written on a piece of rough sackcloth, using ink made from charcoal and water, in handwriting that betrayed her fear but also her determination to bear witness to the unspeakable. She wrote of the selection process, the mysterious births, the pale and sickly infants, and, most damning of all, what she had witnessed in Cora's chamber that final, terrible night. Armed with this horrific accusation, Thorne would soon face a choice that would test not only his courage, but his willingness to risk everything for the sake of victims whose voices had been forever silenced by the very system meant to protect them. The sackcloth testimony reached Thorne's hands on a moonless November night, passed to him by trembling fingers during what appeared to be a chance encounter in the plantation's linen closet. Hester spoke in whispers that barely disturbed the air, her words coming in urgent fragments that painted a picture so monstrous that Thorne's first instinct was to dismiss it as the ravings of a mind broken by the cruelties of bondage. But the specificity of her accusations, the precise details about dates and procedures, and most of all the raw terror in her eyes convinced him that whatever was happening at Halcyon Grove went far beyond the routine horrors of plantation life. Reading her testimony by candlelight in his temporary quarters, Thorne felt his ordered world of numbers and ledger books crumble around him. The accusations were specific enough to be verified, detailed enough to be investigated, and horrifying enough to demand action despite the obvious dangers of pursuing them. If Hester was telling the truth, he was not merely conducting a financial assessment, but documenting evidence of systematic murder disguised as medical care. His first instinct was to examine the plantation ledgers with new eyes, searching for patterns that might corroborate Hester's claims. What he found made his hands shake as he traced the entries with his finger. The births were all recorded in the same matter-of-fact style used for livestock, but the mortality rate among infants born to the selected mothers was not just high, it was absolute. Every single child born under these circumstances was listed as deceased within days of delivery, their deaths attributed to various constitutional weaknesses that seemed to repeat with suspicious regularity. More disturbing still were the marginal notations that he had initially overlooked, small symbols and abbreviated phrases that seemed to serve as some kind of internal code. Next to each recorded death was a notation about spoilage and yield, terms more appropriate to agricultural inventory than human mortality. The pattern suggested not tragedy but process, not medical misfortune but calculated outcome. Emboldened by these discoveries, Thorne began to conduct his own covert investigation of the plantation's physical spaces. Late at night, when the main house had settled into its uneasy quiet, he crept through hallways that creaked with age and secrecy, searching for evidence that might confirm or refute Hester's testimony. His search of the infirmary revealed medical supplies that seemed oddly inappropriate for childbirth, instruments that belonged more properly in a surgical theater than a delivery room. but it was his exploration of Cora's private chambers that provided the most unsettling discoveries. The room was indeed arranged as Hester had described, with an ornate cradle that showed no signs of use and shelves lined with small porcelain bowls that gleamed with an almost surgical cleanliness. Hidden in a locked cabinet, he found vials of dark liquid that seemed to shimmer with an oily consistency, their contents labeled only with cryptic symbols that meant nothing to his trained accountant's eye. His boldest venture took him deep into the swampland behind the plantation, following Hester's directions to search for the unmarked graves she claimed held the remains of the murdered infants. The search was treacherous, conducted by moonlight through bog and canebrake, but eventually he found what appeared to be a series of small mounds barely visible beneath the accumulated debris of successive floods. The graves were too small and too numerous to be explained by natural infant mortality, suggesting a systematic disposal of evidence that spoke to long-term planning, rather than isolated incidents. It was during his return from this nocturnal expedition that Thorne encountered Silas Halcyon, the eldest son materializing from the shadows, like a specter with his silver-tipped cane gleaming in the pale light. The confrontation was brief but chilling, Silas speaking in the measured tones of a man accustomed to being obeyed when he suggested that Thorne would be wise to confine his investigations to the plantation's financial records and leave other matters to the family's discretion. The physical proof remained frustratingly elusive, circumstantial evidence that pointed toward horror, but fell short of the definitive confirmation that would justify the accusations Thorne was beginning to formulate. But the numbers on the page were about to tell their own story, a mathematical narrative of systematic evil that would prove more damning than any physical evidence he might have discovered in the swamps of Blackgum County. For a man whose life had been built on the certainty of mathematical precision, Elias Thorne found a perverse comfort in returning to the cold objectivity of the plantation ledgers. Numbers, unlike the whispered testimonies and shadowy suspicions that had consumed his nights, possessed an honesty that could not be corrupted by fear or imagination. If the horrors Hester described were real, they would leave traces in the meticulous record-keeping that formed the backbone of any successful agricultural enterprise. Armed with Hester's testimony and his own growing suspicions, Thorne began to approach the Halcyon Grove ledgers not as a financial assessor but as a forensic investigator, searching for patterns that might reveal the mathematical signature of systematic murder. What he discovered was a story told in stark numbers and clinical terminology that was more damning than any eyewitness account could have been. The mortality statistics alone painted a picture of impossibility masquerading as misfortune. According to the official records, the infant mortality rate at Halcyon Grove was not merely high, it was selective with surgical precision. Children born to the general enslaved population died at rates consistent with other plantations in the region. Tragic, but within the bounds of medical reality given the primitive conditions and limited health care available to bondspeople. But infants born to the select group of women Hester had identified died with mathematical certainty, a mortality rate of 100%. That defied every known law of medicine and statistics. More revealing still were the dates and intervals recorded in the ledger's margins, numbers that corresponded exactly to Hester's recollections of when specific women had been moved to the infirmary and when their children had allegedly perished. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, too systematic to be explained by natural causes, and too consistent to be the result of medical incompetence or neglect. But it was the financial notations that provided the most chilling insight into the true nature of what was happening at Halcyon Grove. Each deceased infant was recorded not as a human tragedy, but as a failed investment, their deaths categorized using terminology more appropriate to spoiled crops or defective livestock. The phrase "yield nil" appeared with haunting regularity, followed by calculations that seemed to assess the cost of the mother's care against the plantation's expected return on investment. Cross-referencing these entries with Cornelius Halcyon's final testament revealed the full scope of the financial pressure driving the horror. The plantation's value was legally tied to its population of enslaved people, creating a desperate mathematics where human lives became literal currency in a failing economic system. The breeding program was not merely an expression of sadistic cruelty, but a calculated attempt to increase the plantation's asset base through forced reproduction. Yet the numbers revealed an even more disturbing truth. The systematic death of the selected infants was not reducing the plantation's theoretical value, because the deaths were being recorded in ways that obscured their true nature. Stillbirths and infant deaths from constitutional weakness carried no legal implications for the plantation's assessed worth, while live births that survived to maturity would increase the estate's value exponentially. The ledger told the story of a system designed to have it both ways, claiming the financial benefits of increased births, while eliminating the human products of those births through means that left no legal trace. It was accounting fraud elevated to the level of genocide, bookkeeping that transformed murder into mere administrative adjustment. Most damning of all were the coded references to what the ledger euphemistically termed medical supplies and treatments, expenses that corresponded exactly to the dates when infants had died and when Cora's mysterious revitalization had been observed by household staff. The amounts were substantial enough to suggest something far more elaborate than simple medical care, but specific enough to indicate regular planned expenditures rather than emergency responses to medical crises. The mathematical evidence was overwhelming, a numerical indictment that spoke of premeditation, system, and cold-blooded calculation. Every entry, every notation, every carefully recorded death pointed to the same impossible conclusion: that Halcyon Grove was operating not as a plantation, but as a killing ground, where human lives were harvested like crops, and their deaths recorded with the same clinical detachment used to document any other agricultural process. The numbers pointed to a calculated evil that operated with business-like efficiency, but they still could not explain the most fundamental question that haunted Thorne's investigation: why any human being would construct such an elaborate system of horror in the first place. The answer to that question would come sooner than Thorne expected, delivered not through careful investigation, but through the desperate urgency of a crisis that would strip away all pretense and force the truth into the harsh light of accusation. On the night of November 23, 1847, as a cold rain drummed against the windows of Halcyon Grove, another infant was born in the isolated infirmary, and Hester made a decision that would change everything. The child, born to a young woman named Rebecca, was strong and healthy, possessed of the kind of robust vitality that should have guaranteed survival, even under the primitive medical conditions of the plantation. But Hester had seen too many such children disappear into the main house, and she could no longer stand by as another innocent life was sacrificed to whatever monstrous appetite had consumed the Halcyon family. As Cora approached the infirmary to collect her newest victim, Hester created a diversion that would give Thorne the opportunity he needed to witness the truth firsthand. Setting fire to a pile of cotton bales behind the quarters, Hester drew the attention of everyone on the plantation, while Thorne, alerted by her prearranged signal, made his way through the chaos to position himself where he could observe what happened when Cora entered the infirmary. What he saw confirmed every horrible suspicion that had been growing in his mind since he first read Hester's testimony. Cora emerged from the building carrying a bundle wrapped in clean white cloth, moving with the measured steps of someone performing a familiar ritual. Instead of heading toward the main house as expected, she walked directly to a small outbuilding that Thorne had previously dismissed as a storage shed. Following at a distance, he positioned himself at a window where he could observe the interior, and what he witnessed would haunt him for the rest of his life. The building had been converted into what could only be described as a private laboratory, equipped with surgical instruments, glass vessels, and apparatus that belonged in a medical college rather than a plantation outbuilding. Cora unwrapped the infant and placed it on a table, speaking to herself in soothing tones about the necessity of renewal and the ancient wisdom that modern society had forgotten in its squeamish morality. When Thorne could bear no more, he burst through the door and confronted Cora directly, his voice shaking with rage and horror as he accused her of systematic murder disguised as medical treatment. The mathematical evidence was overwhelming, he told her. The ledgers told a story of calculated infanticide, and Hester's testimony provided eyewitness confirmation of horrors that civilized society would never countenance. But Cora's response was not denial or defensive protestation. Instead, she looked at him with the calm certainty of someone whose actions were justified by necessities that lesser minds could never comprehend. The family was dying, she explained, weakened by generations of inbreeding and constitutional deficiency that threatened to end the Halcyon line entirely. The infants provided what she termed vital essence, a concentrated form of life force that could restore vitality to bloodlines that had grown thin and corrupt. The process was not murder, she insisted, but transformation, a way of ensuring that the strength of the young could be passed to those who needed it most. The enslaved women were providing a service more valuable than any labor they could perform in the fields, and their children were fulfilling a purpose greater than any life they might have lived in bondage. It was science, she claimed, based on principles that went back to ancient times, when wise women understood truths that modern medicine had forgotten. Silas appeared in the doorway, his silver-tipped cane gleaming in the lamplight, and for a moment Thorne thought he might find an ally in the eldest son. But Silas stood beside his mother with the resigned compliance of someone who had long since abandoned any moral objections to her methods. Abner cowered in the corner, whittling frantically at a piece of wood as if the repetitive motion could block out the confrontation unfolding around him. The argument that followed was brief but definitive. Thorne threatened to expose everything to the authorities, to bring in federal marshals if necessary, to stop the horror. Cora responded with threats of her own, reminding him that his own secrets made him vulnerable to accusations that could destroy his career and his freedom. But Thorne had reached a point where his conscience would no longer allow silence. Regardless of the personal cost, he was forcibly expelled from the plantation that very night, thrown bodily from the main house by Silas and a group of field hands who acted on Cora's orders. As he stumbled through the rain toward the county road, clutching his hastily packed belongings and the copies of ledger entries he had managed to preserve, Thorne believed he had witnessed the full extent of the evil that festered at Halcyon Grove. Cast out into the storm, he was convinced that he understood the truth behind the legend, but the real truth was both more banal and more terrifying than anything his imagination had conjured in those sleepless nights spent documenting the mathematical signature of systematic murder. 3 days after his violent expulsion from Halcyon Grove, Elias Thorne found himself sitting in the modest parlor of Dr. Alistair Finch, his copied ledger entries spread across the physician's desk like evidence in a criminal trial. Thorne had come seeking medical confirmation of what he believed he had witnessed, hoping that Finch's scientific training could provide the objective analysis needed to support his accusations against the Halcyon family. But what Finch revealed would shatter every assumption Thorne had made about the nature of the horrors at Halcyon Grove, replacing the supernatural evil he thought he had uncovered with a reality that was somehow both more ordinary and more damning than anything his imagination had conceived. The vials Thorne had discovered in Cora's chamber, which had seemed so sinister in their dark mystery, were revealed through Finch's chemical analysis to contain nothing more threatening than a mixture of goat's milk, wine, and common herbal tonics available at any apothecary. The elaborate laboratory equipment that had appeared so menacing in the converted outbuilding was standard medical apparatus that could be found in any physician's office, arranged in a way that suggested ritual significance but possessing no actual scientific purpose. Most devastating of all was Finch's medical assessment of Cora Halcyon's condition, a diagnosis that stripped away the supernatural explanations and revealed a truth rooted in the well-documented science of hysteria and delusion. Cora was indeed suffering from a genuine illness, but not the hereditary blood disorder she claimed was consuming her family. Instead, she was afflicted with what Finch termed severe hysterical neurosis, a condition that manifested in elaborate delusions about her health and an obsessive belief in the efficacy of treatments that existed only in her disordered mind. The revitalization that household staff had observed following each infant death was not the result of consuming vital essence, but rather the psychological relief that came from believing she had received effective treatment. Her condition operated on a cycle of perceived decline followed by imagined restoration, a pattern that required increasingly elaborate rituals to maintain the illusion of medical efficacy. But the most horrifying revelation was yet to come. The infants had not been killed for their blood or subjected to arcane medical procedures. They had simply been allowed to die through deliberate neglect, abandoned in conditions that guaranteed their demise while Cora performed her meaningless rituals with harmless substances. The real monster was not a supernatural creature consuming the life force of the innocent, but a woman whose madness had convinced her that infanticide was a form of medicine. The breeding program itself was not driven by occult beliefs, but by the cold mathematics of slavery and financial desperation. Cora needed to increase the plantation's enslaved population to meet her late husband's will requirements, but she also needed to ensure that the resulting children would not burden the estate with additional expenses. The solution was a system that produced births for the ledger while eliminating the human costs through methods that appeared medical rather than murderous. The legend of consumption and vampiric feeding was a story the family had constructed to make sense of their own actions, a narrative that transformed calculated cruelty into supernatural necessity. It was easier to believe in ancient wisdom and vital essences than to confront the reality that they were systematically murdering infants for bookkeeping purposes. Even Silas and Abner's compliance became understandable when viewed through this lens. They were not participants in an occult ritual, but accomplices in a financial fraud that happened to involve human lives. Their mother's delusions provided a comforting mythology that disguised the simple truth. They were killing children to balance the books. The mathematical evidence that had seemed so damning to Thorne took on a new and even more chilling significance. The systematic nature of the deaths, the coded notations in the ledgers, the precise timing of births and deaths, all pointed not to supernatural consumption, but to bureaucratic efficiency applied to the most fundamental violation of human decency. With the monstrous myth stripped away, what remained was not the romantic horror of Gothic legend, but the bleak reality of how quickly civilized people could descend into systematic evil when financial pressure combined with unchecked power over vulnerable lives. Armed with Dr. Finch's analysis and his own mathematical evidence, Elias Thorne made his way to the county seat, determined to bring the horrors of Halcyon Grove before whatever legal authority might have the power to intervene. But the reality of antebellum Alabama justice proved as implacable as the swamps that surrounded the plantation, and Thorne would discover that some truths were too inconvenient for official recognition. Sheriff John Bullock received Thorne's complaint with the weary resignation of a man who had long since learned to balance justice against practical considerations. The Halcyon family, despite their obvious decline, remained among the county's largest taxpayers and most established landowners. Their plantation provided employment for dozens of free workers, contributed substantially to the local economy, and represented the kind of old money respectability that formed the backbone of the county's social order. More damaging to Thorne's credibility was his status as an outsider, a traveling bookkeeper with his own financial troubles and a documented history of questionable business practices. When Cora Halcyon appeared at the sheriff's office to present her version of events, she painted Thorne as a desperate man who had attempted to extort money from her family by threatening to spread malicious rumors designed to destroy their reputation. Her accusations carried the weight of social position and local connections that Thorne simply could not match. The complaint was officially recorded in the sheriff's ledger as entry number 187, but within days, it had been marked resolved unfounded and filed away in a manner that suggested it would never see daylight again. The mathematical evidence that had seemed so damning to Thorne was dismissed as the misinterpretations of a man unfamiliar with the legitimate complexities of plantation record-keeping, while Hester's testimony was disregarded entirely as the desperate fabrication of an enslaved woman seeking to cause trouble for her owners. But Hester would pay the most terrible price for her courage in speaking truth to power. Within a week of Thorne's official complaint being dismissed, she found herself sold to a cotton plantation in the Mississippi Delta, separated forever from her family and community at Halcyon Grove. The bill of sale recorded her transfer with the same clinical detachment used to document any other business transaction. Her years of service and intimate knowledge of the plantation's secrets reduced to a single-line entry, valuing her at $600. The enslaved community that remained at Halcyon Grove fell into a silence that was deeper and more complete than anything that had come before. The women who had survived the selection process spoke of their experiences only in whispers, and even those whispers eventually faded as the community learned that some truths were too dangerous to preserve in memory. The infants who had died were forgotten by official records, their brief lives erased from history as completely as if they had never existed at all. Within the broader community, the story began to transform in ways that made it more palatable to local sensibilities. The supernatural elements were emphasized while the financial and sexual exploitation was minimized, creating a legend that spoke of ghostly visitations rather than systematic infanticide. It became a tale that could be told at social gatherings without implicating the fundamental structures of power that had made such horrors possible. Halcyon Grove itself entered accelerated decline. Cora died in her sleep in 1852, Silas disappeared in 1854, and Abner was eventually committed to the state asylum. The plantation house stood empty, its columns crumbling under neglect, the quarters abandoned, the fields returned to swamp. Tax records from 1855 show the property assessed at a fraction of its former value, listed as unsuitable for agriculture due to flooding and structural deterioration. By the time of the Civil War, Halcyon Grove had become nothing more than a local curiosity, a ruin that served as a reminder of how quickly wealth and power could crumble when built on foundations of systematic cruelty. The world moved on, but the land and the legend never quite forgot. And the whispers that had once carried truth would eventually carry only the sanitized horror of ghost stories designed to thrill rather than indict. More than 170 years after the last resident abandoned Halcyon Grove, the ruins still draw visitors whose fascination with the macabre outweighs their interest in historical accuracy. The crumbling columns and vine-covered foundations have become a pilgrimage site for amateur paranormal investigators, ghost hunters with expensive equipment, and bloggers seeking content that will generate clicks through sensational headlines and manufactured mystery. The version of the story they tell bears little resemblance to the sordid reality of financial desperation and systematic infanticide that actually unfolded in those swampy bottomlands. Instead, they speak breathlessly of vampire aristocrats and blood-drinking rituals, of supernatural consumption and ancient curses that transformed a noble southern family into creatures of unholy appetite. Their electromagnetic field detectors beep meaningfully in the ruins, while they narrate tales of Cora Halcyon as a figure of Gothic romance, rather than a mentally ill woman whose delusions provided cover for calculated murder. The internet has amplified these distortions exponentially, with paranormal websites and social media accounts competing to present the most sensational version of events. One popular blog post describes Halcyon Grove as the site of America's first documented vampire coven, complete with fabricated historical documents and digitally enhanced photographs that purport to show spectral figures in the ruins. Another claims that Cora Halcyon discovered the secret of immortality through infant blood consumption, supported by testimonials from visitors who claim to have witnessed her ghostly figure wandering the plantation grounds. These modern mythmakers have no interest in the mundane horror of ledger entries that reduced human lives to accounting problems, or the systematic exploitation of enslaved women whose voices were silenced by the very system meant to protect them. The real story lacks the romantic appeal of supernatural evil, offering only the bleak reality of how economic pressure and unchecked power can transform ordinary people into monsters, more terrifying than any creature of legend. But in 2019, a graduate student researching antebellum medical practices made a discovery that would challenge the comfortable fiction that had grown up around Halcyon Grove. While examining archived county records in the Alabama Department of History, she uncovered Elias Thorne's personal journal, donated decades earlier by a distant relative who had found it among family papers. Alongside the journal were Dr. Finch's medical folio and several pages of plantation ledger entries that had somehow survived when the main records were destroyed. These documents told a very different story from the one that had been passed down through generations of ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts. They spoke of hysteria rather than vampirism, of financial fraud rather than supernatural consumption, of systematic neglect rather than arcane ritual. The mathematical evidence was still there, still damning in its precision, still pointing to the same horrific conclusion that had driven Thorne from the plantation more than a century and a half earlier. The discovery should have corrected the historical record, should have shifted focus from supernatural sensationalism to the very real horrors of how slavery enabled systematic abuse that went far beyond the already considerable cruelties acknowledged by mainstream historical narratives. Instead, the academic publication of these findings was largely ignored by the paranormal community, which preferred their familiar mythology to the challenging reality of documented historical evidence. The ruins of Halcyon Grove continue to attract visitors seeking thrills rather than truth, their electromagnetic readings and temperature fluctuations providing the kind of evidence that feeds social media content, while avoiding the uncomfortable questions raised by plantation ledgers and medical records. So what, in the end, are we to make of the Lady of Halcyon Grove and the legend that has grown up around her like Spanish moss draping itself over the bones of the past? The truth about Cora Halcyon's systematic consumption of infant blood may have been stripped of its supernatural trappings, but the fundamental horror remains unchanged. She engaged in acts of cannibalism that violated the most basic taboos of human civilization. The infants were not merely murdered, they were consumed, their blood drawn and ingested in rituals that Cora believed would restore her failing vitality. Dr. Finch's analysis revealed that the substances in her vials were harmless, but this only makes the truth more disturbing. The real blood, the actual consumption, happened before those harmless tonics were prepared. The porcelain bowls in her chamber were functional vessels, used to collect and serve the vital essence that Cora extracted from her victims before disposing of their small bodies in the swampland. Each ledger notation of spoilage represented not just a death but an act of consumption, a feeding that temporarily sustained Cora's delusion of renewed health. The systematic nature of the operation was the methodical management of a cannibalistic enterprise disguised as medical treatment. What makes this case unique in American horror is not the cannibalism itself, but how it was systematized and hidden beneath plantation respectability. Cora was not a savage driven by hunger, but an educated woman who constructed elaborate frameworks to justify consuming human infants while maintaining her social position. The enslaved women were unwilling participants in a cannibalistic cycle that treated their children as livestock to be harvested. Their silence was enforced by the knowledge that speaking truth about such horrors would be dismissed as ravings of minds broken by bondage. The legend persists because it reminds us that systematic evil exists not in supernatural monsters but in ordinary people, whose power creates opportunities for unimaginable cruelty. The plantation system that enabled Cora's cannibalistic practices was the same system millions accepted as natural, differing only in degree from slavery's normalized horrors. The infants whose blood fed Cora Halcyon's delusions were casualties of a system that treated human lives as expendable resources, their deaths recorded with the same clinical detachment used for any business transaction. Their names were never recorded, their graves never marked, their brief existence reduced to ledger notations about yield and spoilage. If you've followed this investigation to its conclusion, subscribe and share this story, because the horrors we uncover in the past continue to echo in systems of power that remain unchanged. The most frightening truth about the Lady of Halcyon Grove is not that she was unique, but that she was an extreme expression of cruelties her system had already normalized. The blood she consumed may have been real, but the monsters who enabled her were entirely human.